I probably shouldn't be admitting all this on camera, but I bought a bunch of books and I absolutely swallowed them. And it meant that then, first of all, I could just learn the terminology that I needed to know. So when I was asked questions about it, I could talk the talk. One of the first things I was tasked with when I joined was they wanted to switch to a squad structure. And I was like, yeah, sounds great. I had no fucking idea what a squad structure was. So I just had to go do a load of research on it and then be very opinionated about why I thought it was the right thing to do. So I definitely think there is an element of fake it till you make it, but it worked.
Welcome to the Startup CEO Succession podcast, where we dive deep into the pivotal journey of founder CEOs who face the critical decision. Should you continue leading your business or bring in a new leader? I'm your host, Evgeny Shadchnev. As a founder coach and author specializing in CEO succession, I interview founders, chief executives, and investors who share their stories of navigating this transition. Today, I'm speaking with Nic Yeeles, VP of Product at Resi, the UK's largest home extension company that helps countless homeowners to design and build reasonably priced home extensions. Before becoming a VP of Product, Nic founded several of his own businesses and sold some of them. But at some point, he decided to go and get a job at another startup as a VP of Product instead of starting another business. In our conversation today, we discuss what was it like for Nic to go from the identity of a founder CEO to the identity of working for someone else, how he faked it till he made it as a VP of Product, and also what value he brings to the table when he is acting effectively as a right-hand man to the CEO in another business. Enjoy the conversation. Hello, Nic. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have an amazing conversation. We've known each other for, I think, about 10 years at this point, for a very long time.
Whoa, that's scary.
Yeah. You joined the Makers, the coding bootcamp that I founded about, I think must have been in 2014, right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
And then you used your coding skills to build a tech company, a tech startup Peg. And a few years later, you sold it. Can you share the story of what Peg was doing and how come you exited it?
Yeah, sure. So before I started at Makers Academy, I had found myself very weirdly as a director producer for Simon Cowell, working on a new YouTube channel that we'd launched for him. It was a partnership between Simon and Google. And it ended up becoming the fastest growing YouTube channel in the world by collaborating with these YouTube influencers. And it was very, very early nascent days of influencer marketing. And I could see that the way the world was going, that more and more brands were going to want to work with these kind of influencers and know how to find the right ones, how to measure the ROI when working with them and so on. And so I had this idea for a product and thought, I want to be able to build a prototype of it myself. And I thought it was crucial that I could understand how to code to do that, hence going on Makers Academy. And literally it was day one after Makers Academy. I didn't give myself a break at all, literally just started building a prototype with my co-founder who I met on the Academy as well, Julia. And over the next sort of 6 or so years, we built it to being used by about 1,700 companies across 169 countries. And I mean, we had some crazy ups and downs on the journey. We learned a hell of a lot. But fundamentally, the way that the industry changed and evolved honestly became something that it started to feel quite dirty to me. When I first got into influencer marketing, it was this really exciting thing because it was about democratizing content and allowing anyone to create anything they wanted. But then the industry started becoming very vain and vacuous and about shifting bad products with no morals. And it was just something that I honestly became quite ashamed to be a part of. And so myself and my two co-founders, Alex and Julia, we decided to exit the company. And we had this idea in our mind as well that we really wanted to build something that was going to try and tackle climate change next. So it felt like we had kind of come to this logical end of it. And we found an acquirer and can obviously go into a lot more detail on that if you want. And then that's when the next chapter of our journey began.
Yeah. So you sold Peg and you started climate impact startup. I think I was one of the early customers, or at least I tried your product or was very interested in it. So
Yeah.
you started building another product with the same founding team.
Yeah, so Julia and I started building the next company that was called Robin. It ended up becoming a food waste collection and recycling company, which I never thought I would go into something like that. Alex, unfortunately, our CTO, he decided to. Well, actually, no, he stayed at the time with the company that acquired us, so he became the CTO there. So it was Julia and I who started setting up the next company.
Yeah, and what happened to that company?
So the long and short of it was that it was really interesting, and it started actually going pretty well. We started getting traction. We developed a really interesting business model, and it was basically trying to completely rethink how food waste collection is done, and trying to prevent so much food waste going to landfill and releasing methane. And we ended up working with the government to basically do a full life cycle assessment analysis of the carbon emissions, like what impact could we have. And we really counterintuitively found that basically the better the company did, almost the worse of the impact we would have. And the reason for that was because the way that the waste industry works is that the councils have paid a ton of money for these big expensive lorries on the roads to go and collect food waste. And actually, if we ended up competing with that, if we started taking households away from them, even if we were doing a better job, it would have meant that they would have been losing their economies of scale, and they would effectively then have to withdraw their own vehicles. And so actually, then less people would have their food waste recycled. And so we realized that the only way to have the kind of impact that we wanted was for the councils themselves to become our customers. So we looked into that, and they were really interested in what we were doing, and they wanted to go ahead and use our services. But the issue was that whole industry is very backwards and slow. The contracts that they have in place with the existing waste companies were for about 7 to 14 years long. So it fundamentally just would have been way too slow. And the whole reason that Julia and I wanted to set this up was we wanted to move faster than governments. And so we just thought, you know what, if we can't move faster than them because we're relying on them, then maybe we just call it a day on this one. So that was the point that Julia and I decided to shut down that one and hand our customers over to an existing waste company.
Yeah. So you made a really good effort to learn some non-obvious lessons about what it's like to tackle a really big problem, but ultimately realized that it's the wrong way to approach it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such an important skill to learn for entrepreneurs is it's a very crude expression, but what they call kill your babies is don't get too attached to ideas. Ideas are pretty easy. It's the execution that's hard. And so actually it's much better to decide sooner rather than later that something's not going to be worth investing more in. So yeah, it was a tough time. It was a tough decision, but it was ultimately the right one.
Yeah. And what did you do next?
I really wanted to build another company then with Julia, but unfortunately by that point she was at her wit's end with startup life and thought, you know what, I would love to just go and specialize in one particular skill, hone that craft, and she wanted to be a software engineer. So she went off to do that. And so that was tough, It was like almost worse than a breakup because your co-founder, I mean, as you'll know firsthand, right? It's you spend more time with them than your actual partner. And she was like, my right arm. So I thought long and hard about, do I do something again on my own or do I go and do something else? But honestly, I didn't question it for too long. I just thought I'm gonna start building my own next company again. And so I had started working on this piece of software that was going to measure and track product market fit for companies. And then I got contacted by someone who wanted me to help with a little piece of contract work, an advisory piece, because we had a mutual investor. I didn't really want to do it because I wanted to focus on my next startup. And I put together this presentation for the CEO to say, here are all the people I know in the industry that I think could be really good for it. And she said, well, why haven't you put yourself forward? And I was like, well, I'm kind of busy with what I'm doing here. And she ended up convincing me, could I join for just a few months to help get it off the ground? So I did that. And then things just kind of snowballed from there. She ended up asking me to take over from the marketing director who was leaving. And before I knew it, within a few months, I was heading up the B2B marketing, the B2C marketing, the creative team, the partnerships team, and the customer success team. And so I'd become pretty ingrained in it, and she had convinced me to stay full time. And so, yeah, it was really by complete accident that I ended up working for another company rather than setting up my own company again.
Yeah. So you got pulled into helping someone else and then over time joined them full time.
Yeah, because what was interesting was initially I was very anti it. I thought, there's definitely this ethos amongst entrepreneurs that, once a founder, you're unemployable, and I can see why. We're a pain in the ass for sure. But what was interesting was actually by joining this company, they had raised £18 million seed investment. They were growing crazy fast. We grew from a team of 4 to 120 in a year, raised from top tier VCs. And it was an interesting area. It was about building plant-based food brands. There was a climate angle to it. And I just thought, actually, there's something pretty appealing about walking into a company and into a role where you've already got a team, you've already got a budget, you actually get paid a good salary as well, not founder's salary. And there was something quite exciting about that.
And what happened next?
So the first thing that surprised me about it was because I had no idea if I worked for someone else, what would my role even be? I think that's one of the classic challenges with once you've been a CEO, you've kind of become a jack of all trades in a sense. So how do you position yourself in one area? And what I realized was actually being the jack of all trades was a massive advantage because everyone else that I was working with in the senior leadership team, they were incredibly good at their roles. They could be really great at sales or marketing or product or whatever that was. But no one else thought holistically about the whole company and strategy and how that intertwined like the CEO did. And so what I found was I quite quickly became like the sort of the right hand to the CEO in a way. I think she leaned on me for quite a lot of strategic support because she was also, she didn't have a co-founder. So I think I was able to give her a lot of that support. But after a while, I started to really clash with her, to be honest. I think one of the challenges of being a CEO before is that you've made a ton of mistakes, or at least I have. Like, maybe I can't assume that everyone has. I think we all make loads of mistakes, right? And it's like they become your scars. You're like, okay, I'm never going to do that mistake again. So then when you see someone else doing that and you see a train heading towards a brick wall, you're like, no, fuck no, don't do that. And I started to find it incredibly challenging then not having the reins and not being able to take things in the way that I wanted to. And that could be anything from a big strategic piece to the culture and the values and how we would treat staff and so on. And so ultimately I decided, this company wasn't going to be for me. And I also decided that role wasn't going to be for me. I didn't really want to do marketing anymore. That had been my background. So it was a kind of a natural fit at the time. But I needed to figure out what kind of company do I want to work for and what kind of role do I go do.
So it's really interesting that there are two aspects here. On the one hand, your skill set and your experience as a founder CEO made you really valuable, real good fit for that startup because you could see the big picture and really understand the business as a founder. But at the same time, this very experience made it very difficult to be next to a founder when you disagreed on some things, big or small.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But what I'm hearing from you is that at that moment, you also decided that maybe not at this company, but in principle, working at some other startup could be a viable path.
Yeah. You and I know a lot of founders. Basically, everyone that we know who builds companies don't actually do it to make money. Sure, we all want to make some money along the way, but actually, there's usually much more of a drive to want to improve things, solve big problems. So when I think about the impact that I can have, there was something quite appealing about if you join a startup that's, maybe at sort of Series A, Series B, something like that, they've already got through some of the hardest hurdles at the beginning. And so actually you can land and have quite a big impact very quickly.
And you mentioned that you didn't want to double down on marketing, even though it was your background.
Yeah.
How did you think about what to focus on in terms of skill set?
Yeah, that was a tricky one. I went through quite a process of literally looking at my calendar and looking at what meetings I'd had, what work I'd been doing, and just genuinely what did I enjoy the most. And I thought from everything in the role that I'd just been doing, but back to PEG and the thing that always stood out where I really got this feeling of like a losing of time and having infinite energy. It was always when I was working on product stuff, especially when it was around design as well. But yeah, it was in the realm of product.
So you felt a draw in the direction of product, but at the same time, you didn't have a track record of progressively senior roles in the product function.
No.
So
No,
how did you approach your next career step?
Yeah, it was funny because I first had to figure out what role even was it, because I've been building companies since I was 18. So I've never really had many traditional jobs. So I can't even say, oh, I learned from how these companies did it. And, the way that we ran product at Peg was perhaps fairly unconventional. In the still as CEO, I was incredibly involved. I was effectively acting as like a CEO and a CPO and at times even product designer, just because I enjoyed it so much. And so the first thing was I just started researching, okay, what roles are there out there? Like what titles? And I probably shouldn't be admitting this on camera, but I remember coming across the title of VP of Product, and I was like, oh, that sounds cool. I had never even heard of it before. And the thing that appealed to me about it was that it was described like you're almost a mini CEO. You're like the CEO of the product. And when I looked at the kind of skills that it needed, they very much fit with the kind of skills that I thought I had and enjoyed. I honestly thought there's no way I'm going to be able to walk straight into a VP of product role. Usually people are at least like 10 years in before they get to that. I remember finding the salaries intimidating because I was so used to paying myself a crappy founder salary. I had really distorted my worth. And so when I looked at the salaries, I just thought, there's no way I can get this. But I thought maybe I'll start as sort of product manager role and work my way up. But then I think I actually got headhunted for one of them, and I got really lucky because this company had basically been looking for a VP of product for many, many months. They'd really struggled, and they'd finally found someone that they thought was amazing. And then the CEO had this curveball, and she thought, you know what, I want to have an ex-entrepreneur to be the VP of product. And so they reached out to me as this curveball. And I went through this very grueling interview process. I think it was about 6 stages, 3 or 4 presentations to a lot of different people in the company, and miraculously somehow got it.
So Nic, I'd love to drill into this because there are 2 really interesting parts here. The first one is that you got headhunted for a role that you haven't done before. How did that happen?
So I think it was twofold. One, when I decided that that's the route I was going to go down, I realized I had to rebrand myself. Because if I look at my LinkedIn, for example, effectively my CV, well, I never had a CV. I had to put together a CV, and I was like, what the fuck? How do I do this? I basically went through strategically every part and just tweaked it so it sounded like it had this product element to it. And it was all true, but there was just more emphasis on it. Like, I think I even changed my title on LinkedIn at Peg from CEO to CEO and CPO and product designer. I don't know, something like that. I had held a board position at this organization, Founders. I was specifically looking at the product area, but so I tweaked all the wording to really highlight that kind of stuff. So I think that was the first part. It was rebranding myself. And then I think in terms of the headhunting, I think it was, I'd maybe signed up to a couple of recruiters or something like that. And I think they'd got hold of my details that way for this other kind of role.
Yeah. And then you went through a grueling 6-stage interview process, presenting to different people for a senior role you haven't really done before, and you passed.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
So, again, I probably shouldn't be admitting all this on camera, but I bought a bunch of books and I absolutely swallowed them. For example, one of the best ones was a book called Inspired. Terrible name, but great book. It's like the Bible for product management. Another very influential one was the Lean Product And it meant that then, first of all, I could just kind of learn the terminology that I needed to know. And I would be quite methodical about writing down the things that I didn't know about and then going and doing research on those. So when I was asked questions about it, I could talk the talk. I remember, for example, one of the first things I was tasked with when I joined was they wanted to switch to a squad structure. And I was like, yeah, sounds great. I had no fucking idea what a squad structure was. So I just had to go do a load of research on it and then be very opinionated about why I thought it was the right thing to do. So I definitely think there is an element of fake it till you make it. But it worked.
But it worked. And for anyone listening who is not a founder, this is a great example of what does it mean to be a founder. You identified the goal, you decided you are going to go after it, and then you figured out how to make it happen. Whereas 99% would have said, well, it's a senior role with an impressive salary and I've never done it before. What are the chances? I will not even try.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think of the expression entrepreneurs, people who want to be an entrepreneur and they say, I've got this idea, but I'm not quite ready, or I need to take longer. At least what I found from our friends who are entrepreneurs, they never wait for when they're ready. There is no right time, right? They just cannot resist it. And I guess that kind of follows through to the rest of your career as well, right? I think I've, throughout my whole career, my whole life, have been drowning in the deep end, just trying to figure out how to get through.
Yeah. And this is the quality which I imagine is so valuable for founders who want to hire other entrepreneurs into their C-level team. Because this attitude, it takes years and years to build this skill.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to add 2 points to it. One, I know what I'm talking about now. So if anyone's listening, don't worry, I can actually do the job now. But two, I actually think that skill is not just underrated, but so important, particularly for startups, right? Because if you think about an established company, they understand how the machine works. They know who their customers are. They know what the product is. They know what the proposition is. They know what the revenue model is, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas with a startup, it is literally this unknown beast where you're trying to figure out the answers to these questions as quickly as you can. And so actually what's kind of more important is less about the actual skills that you have, but it's more the ability to fly in the face of the unknown and go and figure out what you got to figure out. So actually, I think even if you do jump into a job you don't really know, if you can figure it out, that says you're probably going to be pretty good at that job.
Yep. So you're a learning machine, like all founders are.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And Nick, the startup that you are talking about right now is not the one that you are with right now, where you are a VP of product at Resi.
Exactly, yeah.
What happened in between? How did you make the decision to leave that company and join the next one?
Yeah, so the next company I joined was in the world of GovTech. It was a company called Apolitical, really fascinating and very impressive company. I've never known such an impressive group of people. Everyone who works there was basically Oxford or Harvard or worked at CERN doing astrophysics, incredibly intelligent and well-meaning people. But there was definitely something that I noticed straight away, which was culturally, I just wasn't a great fit. I really liked the people I got on with them, but there was something about it where I just didn't really feel myself there. And to start with, it was good and it was exciting and I really enjoyed this whole new role that I had. And the CEO, I really, really respected and still do really respect her. Incredibly smart. But again, I came across this challenge of I just severely disagreed with some of the strategic decisions. And ultimately what was happening was I was responsible for quite a large team there because, generally as a VP of product, you're looking after the product managers, you're sometimes looking after the product designers, maybe the analysts. And even though they often don't report into you, you're kind of responsible for the engineers as well. And there was this change that was about to happen. So a whole nother big team was going to report into me as well. And I would have ended up having, I think it was around about 45 people out of a team of out of a company of about 65 people or so, in a sort of a direct or dotted line way reporting into me. And so it meant that it was so important for me and the CEO to be strategically aligned. For the most part, we were, but there were a few things where it just didn't quite line up. And to be perfectly honest, it got to my 6-month probation, and she said, this is a really tough call because there's so much that's so good about it, but I just don't think that this is going to work out. Yeah. So ultimately, that one, I guess I was fired from.
Yeah. It sounds like you learned loads, and I'm noticing the same pattern. You're really valuable because of your entrepreneurial skills and the ability to learn really quickly, but at the same time, it's important and difficult to be exactly on the same page with the CEO, and that's just not easy.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And by this point, you already had 3 VP of product roles on your CV, so I imagine getting the next one was easier.
Yeah, the next one was a lot easier, actually. This one really surprised me. I was actually going through a very tough time in my life, and I thought, you know what, I just need to get away, travel for a while. So I just want to do a piece of consultancy work for a while, a piece of design or something like that. So I put out this message to the Founders Network and just said, hey, does anyone need a bit of work? And I was really, really surprised and humbled by how many offers I had come in. And one of those was from Alex, the CEO of Resi. It was really interesting because I think literally like a couple of years before or so, when I was thinking about what did I want to do next, I brainstormed on a piece of paper, what are the kind of industries that I'm interested in, and then what companies would I want to work for. I've always been fascinated in architecture, and again, climate change was a really big interest for me, and I was interested in how we make homes more sustainable. And Resi was one of those companies on there. And it was funny because all the other companies, it was like your Tesla and your Polestar and Google and so on. So it was actually like quite big established companies. And then Resi was like pretty much the lone startup. And then I actually did a big flat renovation and a design piece, and I worked with Resi as a customer. So I already knew them. I knew what the product was like, and I could sense that there was like really good potential there. And so, when I put out this message, Alex literally picked up the phone to me, and I mean, you know her, she's very persuasive. And she just said, what do I need to do to win? And I won't reveal all the details of what the negotiation of the deal was, but she was convincing at getting me to join.
Yeah. And here is a really important lesson about the power of networks. You and I have been part of this network, founders, and you sending an email to 350 or 400 people, many of whom knew you personally over the years. And Alex was one of them. So in a way, having cultivated relationships for a long time in social and professional setting made it so much easier to find exactly the right person who was looking exactly for your kind of skills.
I wouldn't be here if it weren't for founders. So it's been incredibly valuable.
Yeah. So you joined Resi as VP of product.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How did that go? What has been your experience there?
Yeah. So it was interesting because again, she essentially said, you can have any role you want, do whatever you want. And I was like, okay, that sounds pretty appealing. And I think, again, probably in the first month or so, I still maybe found it a little bit tricky because kind of finding my feet and figuring out how do I do this role. But it wasn't long until I just completely fell in love with it. And I loved the team. I loved the potential that we had. I felt like a really great cultural fit there. And it was in an industry that I really loved as well. And it sort of felt like it ticked all my boxes. But I honestly think the biggest thing was how Alex and Jules, Alex's co-founder, approached me in a sense. Because I would fully admit, I put my hands up. I don't know if this is for all entrepreneurs or just me, but I am certainly a pain in the ass to work with, I think. Don't get me wrong, I have my qualities, but I know I'm incredibly opinionated, and that means across the entire business. I have extremely high ambitions, so I never settle for something that's good enough. I'm constantly trying to push us to do more and better. But I think what they struck so well was that they, even though the company was about 6 years old when I joined, they kind of treated me like a third co-founder in a way. And, I wasn't, not in title or anything. And obviously they had done so much before I had got there, but it was the way that they gave me complete autonomy and freedom to do things however I thought was best. They really trusted my input on all areas of the business. I just think that made such a huge difference because I honestly felt like I was kind of running my own company again without having to start the grind from day one.
Yeah. So it's almost like you found this sweet spot, which is a really good match for your skills as a founder, ex-CEO of your own business. And what Resi, an established company, needed at that point in time.
Yeah. It really, it just worked so well. It was such a good match for both sides, I think. And I think also for them, because they were about 6 years in, as you and I know so well, it's an exhausting process, right? And I think they were pretty tired by that point. They'd been through a lot of punching rounds. So I think me coming in probably gave them a bit of a boost of energy again. And they could release a lot of the burden that they had been feeling onto me. And I think also just having someone else who understood what they were going through. When they go through an investment round or whatever, there's someone there going like, I get it, I've been there, it's really hard. And I think they liked that.
And if you look back at your entire journey as a VP of product across several companies, what was it like for you to go through a change of identity from having done nothing but running your own companies to having a title and a job and some kind of a specification around your role?
Honestly, really hard. And it's something that I'm definitely better now, but it's still a challenge to an extent. All of us who build companies know that so often your whole identity gets wrapped up in that company. Not just that company, but that industry. Like I became like the influencer guy, which is something I fucking hated, which is why I wanted to go into something completely different. And so there is something quite weird when you leave that. Like, who are you then? And I think for a lot of people, they start and build companies probably for some kind of deep-rooted insecurity for some reason. Maybe they've got something to prove to themselves or to others or whatever. And I think when I first started, that's not why I started my first company, but I think it's probably one of the reasons why I enjoyed it, because I was like, oh, suddenly I don't feel so average and useless like I did before. So I was probably building them for the wrong reason initially. And there was too much ego tied up in it. When you then take that away, it's hard for that to not still kind of dig into that ego a little bit. But now I'm definitely at this point where now I build companies for a very, very different reason. Now it genuinely is for the cause of what we're trying to do. And I think that's definitely made it easier.
Yeah. And what has it been like for you to work with other C-level professionals at all those companies who didn't necessarily come from the founder background?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because on the one hand, so much respect for them. I've learned a lot, and in some cases, they probably do things more the right way, so to speak, in inverted commas. But I'd be lying if I didn't say incredibly frustrating as well. I often feel like sort of a lone wolf in some of these things, because I feel like I'll be trying to push very hard on a certain strategy or a way that I think we should do things. But I'm the only one in the room who has been through that before and experienced, for example, what goes wrong if you don't do that, or what goes right if you do this. And that can be really frustrating then if you haven't got anyone to back you up, especially when in all of these cases, I've always been the one who challenges the CEO the hardest. And it comes from a genuinely good place. But then if you haven't got anyone else backing you up and it's just you two going head to head, like that can be pretty challenging.
But what I'm hearing between the lines is that you also had the capacity to challenge the CEO, because as a founder and ex-CEO yourself, I imagine it was much more of a peer level relationship. Even though technically you were reporting into them, it probably felt more like a peer relationship rather than an unequal relationship.
Yeah, it is. And that, I honestly think, is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I think it's what's allowed me to build these very close relationships very quickly with them. But on the other hand, I imagine it's very challenging for them. And I think it takes a real strength of character to be able to hire and work with an entrepreneur like that. And that, again, I think is one of the things that's worked so well about Resi. Alex she has this incredible ability to allow herself to be vulnerable, to admit when she doesn't know things, to admit when she makes mistakes. And I think that's what's worked so well about the dynamic. She hasn't seemed threatened by my presence, where maybe sometimes it has otherwise.
Yeah. And would you recommend that startup CEOs hire other ex-founders as their direct reports, just as a blanket approach, prioritizing ex-founders?
I think it really depends on what stage the business is at and what they're trying to tackle. So, for example, what's been really interesting in the 3 companies that I've joined, they have all raised tens of millions of pounds, and they are already at a fairly decent size, but actually still struggling with product market fit. And it means that they really had to try and figure things out from scratch. There's like this level of traction that they have where they need to protect it, but they also still need to figure out these brand new things. And in those kind of circumstances, I think hiring an entrepreneur is amazing because they have figured out how to crack that 0 to 1. And that is a skill that most employees don't have because they've never had to go through that. But I'd say if the company is already at a larger, more stable stage and they just need to scale, I think absolutely you can still get a lot of value out of an entrepreneur. But I'd say it's less of a necessity.
Yeah. So the entrepreneurial skill set is most valuable when the product market fit needs to be found or strengthened.
Yeah, I think so. Something that we talk a lot about in the group is the idea of being a founder, not a CEO. Those terms get used interchangeably, but they're actually incredibly different things. And being a founder is really, about figuring out that 0 to 1, like finding out what the problem is, how you solve it, figuring out where the market is, and so on. And that's a skill set that a founder has that employees don't typically have, I think.
Yeah. How do you think about your decision not to start another company? Because looking back, you had a great run as a VP of product, but the opportunity cost of that was not starting another startup, even though you've got the skills, the network to do that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and honestly one that I think about a lot as well. I'd definitely be lying if I said that I don't constantly think about, should I start my own thing again someday? I think it's interesting to think about when you say opportunity cost, what are you basing that cost on? So, for example, if it's down to sheer like net worth or something like that, I probably it might have failed, but I probably could have made a lot more by now by building my own company. But when I think about the other things that I've managed to do in my life, like I've really started prioritizing my health a lot more. So getting a PT and going to the gym and cooking more healthily and so on, or whether it's diversifying in my net worth. So I've bought a couple of flats and renovated those and so on. And that would be incredibly difficult to do if I was also running my own company. So I think the opportunity cost, is there. But as with all things, there are pros and cons of both approaches.
Yeah. And how do you think about working for startups versus working for large companies? Because some ex-founders or ex-CEOs go and join late-stage companies like Monzo, for example, or even larger established corporations.
I really think it just comes down to what kind of personality you have and what you're trying to optimize for. So, in some cases, let's say you're optimizing for a family and a more stable life, I think it absolutely makes sense. Go to a larger company and a decent salary. Don't worry about whether the company is going to go bust in a couple months or so. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But at least speaking for myself and a lot of my friends who are entrepreneurs, I think we just have this hunger for trying to solve very hard problems and having autonomy and like a hunger for speed as well. And I just think, speaking for myself, I get incredibly frustrated working at a big company, knowing that I couldn't move as fast as I wanted and have as much autonomy as I wanted and have as much of an impact. There's definitely like a very satisfying feeling as well of being able to come into a company and seeing the impact that you have very quickly. And I think that would be a lot harder to do in a large company.
So it's almost like startups have this balance of moving fast and solving interesting problems on the one hand, but at the same time being more stable and more predictable than just starting your own business.
Absolutely. And that's why for me, I think the sweet spot I found is at that stage where they've kind of raised 10 plus million or so that you do get some of the perks of you get a decent salary and there is already a team in place. And, there aren't some of those like very basic things that have to be put in place first, but you still get all the benefits of feeling entrepreneurial.
Have you considered going freelance, being an advisor to many startups in product or marketing?
Yeah, definitely. And it's, something that crosses my mind a lot because I really enjoy, again, this is probably like quite an entrepreneurial trait that people have. I get bored pretty quickly. Like I need a lot of stimulation and I love tackling new problems. And so there is something appealing to me about constantly trying to figure out new markets, new industries, and so on, and helping other people. And all those mistakes that I've made, passing those on to others. And I get a massive sense of satisfaction out of seeing other people do really well. So there is definitely a massive appeal to that. And I'm sure I'm going to do that at some point in my life. But I really like to get my hands dirty. And I think I'd find it, the frustrations that I have with working with another CEO, I think would be even more frustrating if I couldn't actually, have an even bigger impact on that. If I was just giving advice and then could do nothing about it, I think I'd find that incredibly frustrating.
Yep, I definitely understand it.
Yeah.
And Nic, the way the story looks in the rearview mirror looks very nice and easy. You started the company, sold it, tried to start another one, learned some difficult lessons, and then updated your LinkedIn online, got headhunted, and now you're on your fourth job as a VP of product with a bit of a challenge around identity evolution in the process. What were some of the challenges you had to navigate along the way? What felt the most difficult on the journey?
I think probably that you have no idea what the journey is going to look like until you look backwards. So there were so many points of turmoil that I went through during this journey. For example, what role do I do? Will I be any good at it? What kind of industry do I want to work in? What kind of company do I want to work in? How will I work with the CEO? And now, several years later, I can look back and say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And I really believe in what Steve Jobs said in his Stanford commencement speech, where he said, you can only join the dots looking backwards. But at the time, I had no idea which direction that was going to go. And that's quite a big, scary thing because you're like, oh, my God, this is my life. And, I was also, for anyone listening who is in this situation, like I don't want them to take this to heart at all, but I definitely felt like, oh my God, I'm in my 30s now and all my friends are getting married and having kids and they've got their stable careers and whatever. Like, what the fuck am I doing? Like I'm a mess. Yeah, that's really tough to deal with. But in hindsight, I can look back and say, you know what, it was totally worth it.
And that Stanford commencement speech is such a wise advice. I was actually looking at it just a few days ago because you're absolutely right. The dots connect when we're looking backwards, but in the process, it looks like a mess when we're in the middle of it, trying to build a startup or reinvent our career or just do something genuinely new.
Yeah. But you know what I think is one of the most valuable lessons that I've learned is that I think the more times you go through this kind of stuff, and you really find it building a startup as well, right? Think how many times with your company you metaphorically got punched in the face where you thought, that's it, the company's over, it's dead. And every time there is a way through it. You somehow find a way. And I find that the more of those you go through, the more that the next one comes up, you go, yeah, we're going to get through it. I have no idea what it looks like, but I just know we're going to get through it somehow.
And that's also a very real skill that we learn as entrepreneurs. That even when things look really difficult or even hopeless, we still find a way to maintain a degree of optimism based not on anything we are seeing in front of us, but on our experience, because we've seen hopeless situations before and we found a way through them, even if it was not obvious in the moment.
Absolutely. And I think another really, really valuable lesson that I got from going from Peg to the next company, Robin. So from the influencer marketing software company to the food waste collection and recycling company. I didn't know anything about the waste industry. I didn't know anything about climate change or any of this. I just so desperately wanted to do something that I was really going to believe in and that wouldn't pigeonhole me as the influencer guy anymore. And what was fascinating about it was me and Julia, my co-founder, for the first few weeks, we just dived into a bunch of white papers, just trying to digest them as much as possible. We spent a load of time actually going to waste plants and speaking to all kinds of companies and reading all kinds of journals and all kinds of things. And it was amazing how within 6 months, I'd actually started to be asked to give presentations and talks to companies and stuff because I was a so-called, in inverted commas, expert in this field now. And it was actually quite incredible how much I felt I now knew and could speak confidently about this industry. And that was a really empowering sort of feeling going, actually, you know what? Any industry that I go into, I could probably learn it. And that's why after that, I was able to go into GovTech, and then I was able to go into architecture. And with all of these situations, feel like I could actually, have a big impact and learn whatever I needed to learn.
As entrepreneurs, we are learning machines. And this is what we bring to the table when we are looking at our next step, whether it's working for a small company or a large company, if we're looking to join a business.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Nic, I also remember you saying that one of the lessons you learned was that you underestimated your own skill set, because you were looking at those impressive salaries at the VP of product level and thinking about how little you were paying yourself as a founder, as we tend to do as founders. So it sounds like you learned that you were underestimating yourself, and you also learned how to correct for this bias in the process. What's the lesson here for other entrepreneurs in a similar position that could be listening to us?
I remember us going to one of these founders retreats once, and we were hosting this chat. This was before I'd made this career move. We were hosting this chat about the value of founders and whether they can work for other companies and so on. And everyone was talking about this idea that, our worth is much higher than we realize and so on. And for me, it was just words. I didn't believe it. It was hard to take in. And I think the only way that I was able to come to terms with that was experiencing it firsthand, like realizing time and time again how a CEO who has been building a company for years, who knows the industry much better than I do and so on, could still rely on me so much for my advice and so on. And realizing that the strategies that I was implementing had the ability to massively improve the company. They could be potentially 10xing the company, and the value that you can then bring to the company, if you think of it as you're getting a small portion of that suddenly made me realize, actually, you know what, I am worth the salary that I earn, and in fact, probably a lot more.
So again, a real lesson here in terms of how much value founders or ex-CEOs bring to the table.
Yeah, because again, like in most cases, and this definitely isn't to demean any other roles or anything like that, but so often with the other members of an SLT, they're doing an incredible job. They're tweaking, they're optimizing their area. But even if they do an incredible part of their job, there's only so much more value that it can add. But I think the way that entrepreneurs often think, you really are like, 10xing, 50xing, like the whole value of the company.
Nic, if you think about a founder who is looking for their next step after leaving their business, maybe they step down as a CEO, maybe they're sold their business as you did, and they're trying to figure out what's next for them. What advice What wisdom would you share with them based on your experience?
I think the starting point that actually worked well for me was literally writing down on paper, what did I enjoy the most? Like thinking back to my calendar and the times of the week where I got the most enjoyment, and then figure out what kind of roles fit with that. I'm a fan of Ikigai. I can't remember if it's the Japanese model of how they see your life's purpose. And I think it's a Venn diagram of what you're good at, what the world needs, what you can be paid for, and what you enjoy, I think it is.
I think so.
And if you can find the sweet spot of that, that's your Ikigai, that's your purpose. So I think I just went through quite a methodical process to write those down, and that's what ultimately led me to this, and I'd really recommend that for others as well.
Yeah. So really sitting down and thinking about what can make money, what can help the world, what aligns with your skills, and what gives you joy on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and the joy thing I think is a really interesting one, right? Because when I finally joined, like particularly when I joined Resi, I realized that is probably the happiest I've ever been in my career. I think I've started, I don't know, about 6 or 7 companies since I was 18. And I'm like, that's kind of ironic that now the time I enjoy it the most is someone else's company. Like, what the fuck was I doing all that time? And because it really helped me focus on doing the things that I really enjoyed doing, but it removed a lot of the crap that I didn't enjoy doing. And so I think that's really powerful if people can find that.
Yeah. And you're at a really special kind of company at this point. If you explained, Resi made a lot of progress, found its product market fit, is doing really good work. There is a large team around you. But at the same time, there is so much potential, so much more to do, so many ideas to implement. And so it's both exciting and reasonably stable at the same time.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Nic, as we're preparing to start wrapping up our conversation, what else would you like to share with our listeners that we haven't touched on yet?
I mean, definitely something that I'm finding at the moment is just, it's still really challenging. I still go head to head with Alex. I still probably give her a hard time. And I think that, again, massive credit to her because she has this humbleness to her where she's willing to be wrong. She's willing to be vulnerable. So we can have these very healthy debates. And we fundamentally, and this is, a hard thing to manufacture, we've become very good friends and we fundamentally have a lot of respect and love for each other. So the amount of times where we'll have a blazing row. It's funny because we've got these these meeting pods in the office that are glass on either side and they sit in the middle of the room. The amount of times we'll have a blazing row. She's a crier. And so people will just see us in there with her crying, but then moments later we're up having a big hug and off we go and we're the best of friends again. And I think, in many ways it is a lot like having, a life partner or someone, right? You have to have these big, strong disagreements, but then kiss and make up, metaphorically speaking.
Well, exactly. It's not about not having conflict. It's about resolving it mindfully and finding a way forward instead of preserving artificial harmony and not rocking the boat for as long as possible.
Yeah, exactly.
And Nic, when you hire people for your team at Resi, do you prioritize people with entrepreneurial background?
It again really depends on what kind of role I'm hiring for and what stage of, for example, a product it's at. So, for example, I had a really interesting one that we learned from Peg. We made our first really senior hire over a six-figure salary, 3 times the amount that I was paying myself at the time. And within 6 months, he didn't get a single sale. And we were like, what the hell is going on? He had a really good track record. Like, is it us? Is it the product? What's going on? And we sadly had to let him go. And he ended up becoming the MD for TikTok. I saw him recently, and now he's in some very senior position at Revolut. And I'm like, what the fuck? What did we do wrong? And what I realized was that you fundamentally have two different types of people, like particularly say when it comes to sales. Those who work really well post-product market fit and those who work well pre-product market fit. And he's incredible for post-product market fit. You give him a playbook, he can take it, run with it, and do incredible things. But he wasn't as good at, asking the difficult questions and thinking on his feet when there weren't answers or the product was broken or whatever it was. And we needed to hire a very different type of person for that. And I think that's true for entrepreneurial types. Again, it's like if you need to do something where you've got to figure a lot of the answers out, I would hire someone entrepreneurial. And one of our friends, Andrew Crump, he has a really nice way of talking about it as core and explore. Your core are your business as usual. It's where it's pretty predictable tasks and you have a playbook to follow. And your explore is all the unknowns where you're trying to figure out new stuff. And so typically the way that I'll work is I'll be tackling a new area, explore, and there will be a very specific type of person who works well for that, and they are usually entrepreneurial. Once you've then cracked it, those people get bored. So you then hand it over to core, and that's where someone who prefers a lot more stability and repeatability, they thrive well in that situation.
And I can see a link here to the work that you've done many years ago on writing a book on product market fit and helping others to measure product market fit.
Yeah.
Because right now, this expertise, this sense of what is the strength of the product market fit in the company can help you figure out what kind of skill set would be most relevant for which position and why.
Yeah, exactly. That was an incredibly helpful experience, actually. And I think really helped with the transition to VP of product, because so the root of the story for that was with Peg, we were about 4 years in. We already had very good traction at that time. We had about 51 investors. We had customers in well over 100 countries. And Facebook faced the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And they, as a reaction, decided to remove their data API from all third parties. And that included us. So it effectively rendered our tool useless overnight. And we were like, fuck, okay, how do we get through this? We're going to have to completely refigure out new product, new business model, and so on. And so I obsessed over the idea of product market fit. And I read as many books as I could, watched as many videos and so on. And I found that like quite a lot of it was contradicting advice. There just wasn't this like coherent order to it. And so I started to try and write a framework basically for like it wasn't anything unique and original, but it was just piecing it together in a logical order. And so I wrote the outlines of this book that you're talking about called Prescale. And when we implemented that, we rebuilt a product from scratch. And within 6 months, we went from having no product to having good traction again and selling the company. So actually just taking that time to obsess over some of these books and actually like literally drawing out the frameworks and piecing it together into my own framework meant that was really lodged in my brain now. So it comes as second nature when thinking about those things.
Again, the dots connect looking backwards.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Nic, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I'm sure our listeners will take a lot from it and learn a lot from your experience. Thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you very much. It's been great fun.
Yeah, likewise. To wrap up our conversation today, I would like to highlight a few points. The biggest one is Nic's resourcefulness. Nic decided not to start another business when he wrapped up his climate change startup, Robin, but instead get a job as a VP of product. And the challenge, of course, was that he was competing against people who spent maybe the last 5 or 10 years growing progressively towards the VP of product role. And even though he had experience by virtue of building his own products and his own companies, he did not have it reflected clearly on his CV. And so he faked it till he made it. He rewrote his LinkedIn to make it look like everything he was doing was all around the product. He read multiple books to really understand the language that is used in the industry. And ultimately, having done several interviews, he found his first VP of product role and then his second, and then I think now he's only his third VP of product role. So this story really shows the resourcefulness that we as founders have when it comes to difficult tasks. The vast majority of people, 99% probably would have given up and said, well, I don't have relevant experience, or difficult to compete, or there are lots of people who want to do the same thing. But Nic didn't give up. He decided to do it, and he did it. And in the process, he realized how much value he brings to the table as an ex-founder, as an ex-CEO. Because being effectively not just a VP of product, but the right hand to another founder, he is in a unique position to really see the entire business holistically, to challenge the strategy, challenge different aspects of the business without really being ultimately responsible for it as a CEO. And this offers a very different perspective compared to what C-level executives without founder experience can offer. And it works well for Nic because he finds himself working for startups which are fairly stable. They are beyond product market fit. So it's not as crazy stressful as early stage startups can be. But at the same time, he can have fun, use his skills, and be incredibly helpful to the companies that he is working for. So my biggest takeaway from this is that founder CEOs who leave their companies in whatever circumstances and decide to go and get another job at another startup do have a lot to bring to the table. And it might not be easy, and we might need to fake it till we make it, as Nic explained. But ultimately, it's possible to find incredible roles in incredible companies and have a lot of fun working in a different capacity. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Don't forget to like and subscribe on the platform of your choice, and speak to you soon.